Hello, my name's Osha. I like to talk about American presidents, and today I'm going to be continuing with my discussion in honor of the Black History Month. Today is February the 12th, 2026. So I've gotten up to the point of discussing the Union's victory in the Civil War. Now, so after President Lincoln was assassinated by, you know, the um, Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth, who was subsequently executed with his co-conspirators, um, Andrew Johnson, who was a Southern Democrat. Yeah, Andrew Johnson was not a Republican; he was a Democrat from the South. Became president. He was highly unpopular with the Republicans who controlled the Senate the uh, uh, and Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. So there were a series of Reconstruction, they were called Reconstruction era acts that had to be passed by Congress in order to, one, help in the integration of the former secessionist states, southern states, the Confederate states, and also to ensure that the newly freed um, uh, formerly enslaved African Americans were able to realize their civil rights as American citizens, and that they were protected against, violence from uh, disaffected white Southerners. And so, amongst um, the Reconstruction era acts was what is called the Military Reconstruction Acts, also the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. So one of the things it did was it divided the South, right, the defeated South, into five military districts, and it had military commanders, and martial law was established in the South. And then it forced the South to draft new constitutions, the southern states to draft new constitutions to aid their readmission into the Union, to also allow black male suffrage. Right, we'll see that with the Reconstruction Act, the Act of 1865. That's the 15th Amendment, right? There was a 15th Amendment, which was later on, sorry, in 1870. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. That allowed for black male suffrage. It enfranchised black men. It gave them the right to vote. So people couldn't be barred again uh, with respect to their race. So and also it also um, you know it ensured black male suffrage, and there was something else that it did. That's the It ensured black male suffrage. It forced them to draft new constitutions, and finally, it forced the southern states, to ratify the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment initially was gradually ushered in, first of all, with the um, Act of 1866, right? So that was the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which said that persons, all people born in the United States, regardless of race, were citizens of the United States. And this eventually it evolved and was, drafted as what we now know as the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all people born in the United States, regardless of race, and it also created due process and equal protection of the law. That's the 14th Amendment. So uh, the the Military Reconstruction Act forced the southern states to ratify that 14th Amendment, and of course, again, to allow black male suffrage, which was introduced with the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, right? And of course, to also create new constitutions, which outlawed slavery. The 13th Amendment was 18 the Constitution, sorry, the 13th Amendment, right, was ratified in 1865, and that was what abolished slavery. So, 13th Amendment, 1865, slavery was abolished. Now, something else um, that the you know that the Reconstruction era acts um, encompassed, right, where the Freedmen's Bureaus Acts, right? The Freedmen's Bureaus Acts of 1865 and 1866. So this created a government agency to provide aid to the formerly enslaved African Americans and also supported refugees, right? So that's the Freedmen's Bureaus. They also helped to foster education, to help educate the freedmen. So that's the Freedmen's Bureaus Act of 1865 and 1866. Then something more, other laws that were more controversial uh, and which shows that Congress was actually more powerful than the president. There was the Tenure of Office Act of 1867, and this restricted the power of the president. That's specifically President Johnson, because the Republicans, were very against President Andrew Johnson, who was a Southerner, who had been a former slave owner himself, and he was a Democrat. And, he opposed the Reconstruction era acts because he thought it was humiliating to the South. So he tried to create obstacles. And so, but the Republicans, who were led by a radical faction that wanted the immediate equal rights of the formerly enslaved black people, realized it wanted them to immediately be able to participate in the political life of America. So they tried to control President Andrew Johnson and put impediments, obstacle to hinder him from being able to dismantle the Reconstruction policies, right, that the radical Republicans had. So they created the Tenure of Office Act of 1867, which restricted the power of the president from being able to remove any official. So any appointee of the president, uh, in order to be fired, Senate approval and consent was required. The president had to obtain Senate consent and approval in order to fire his political appointees, his cabinet members. And I will revisit that. Now, there was something else. Uh, the There was another act that restricted the ability of the president from removing uh, commanders, military commanders, and now so basically this was preventing Andrew Johnson from being able to this prevented Andrew Johnson from being able to remove or interfere with the military commanders you know exercise of martial law in the southern states. So you could see the humiliating acts that were created against the president, and which were basically humiliating President Andrew Johnson, because remember, the president of the United States is supposed to be the commander in chief of the armed forces, but Congress created an act that restricted his ability to interfere with the military commanders in the South who were exercising martial law, and it even prevented him from being able to remove them. Right, so uh, these were a series of amendments that led to conflict and uh, between Congress and President Andrew Johnson, and eventually led to the first impeachment of an American president. So Andrew Johnson, who did not support the Reconstruction era acts and the Reconstruction policies, tried to fire the Secretary of War, a guy called Edwin M. Stanton. He was Secretary of War, and he was a staunch um, radical Republican. So Andrew Johnson, first of all, suspended him while Congress was in recess. This was in August 1867. And later on, when Congress came out of recess, they reinstated him in January 1868. However, um, um, Andrew Johnson, who had actually hired uh, Ulysses Grant, General Ulysses S. Grant, the hero who preserved the Union, he hired him, appointed him as interim Secretary of War. He wanted to get him to fire Stanton and replace him with permanently with Ulysses Grant, but it was becoming, well, Grant wouldn't play ball. Grant was a favorite of the radical Republicans. Of course, he was the hero of the war, and it had become apparent that Grant was going to be Andrew Johnson's rival for the presidency in the upcoming elections. So, which was the case. Grant eventually defeated Andrew Johnson, and Grant became the 18th president of the United States. But prior to that, Andrew Johnson would violate the Tenure of Office Act and fire um, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton in on February 21, 1868. And so that was in violation of the Tenure of Office Act, which prevented the president from being able to fire a cabinet official without obtaining the approval and consent of the Senate. So they impeached Andrew Johnson. He became the first president to be impeached. However, he survived removal, conviction, and removal from office by one vote in the Senate. Right. So, but Andrew Johnson was really humiliated as a president, and of course he was defeated in the elections. And uh, President Ulysses S. Grant became, president of the United States. He won the elections, and he would go on to sign into law the 15th Amendment in 1870, which enfranchised black men, gave black men the vote. Again, remember laws are being uh, laws are being written into being encoded in the U.S. Constitution, it's universally applicable. So it basically says that, well, the 15th Amendment was basically saying that um, people could vote regardless of race, national origin, and things like that, or their former status of being, former status of servitude, right? So basically, it had originally had black men in mind, but it's written in such a flexible and universally applicable way that it would apply to a Chinese American who was born in America as well. So there are later laws that we deal with that address these things. That, well, was the 14th Amendment applicable to other people who weren't Black Americans? That has since been settled. I've done videos in which I explain these things, pursuant to the Chinese Exclusion Act under Chester A. Arthur, and further other racist and xenophobic laws that were passed by other presidents, including Woodrow Wilson and Calvin Coolidge. But right now, this is focusing on the Reconstruction era acts. You can watch my other videos in which I discuss uh, the uh, the Chinese Exclusion Act. But in any event, so President Ulysses S. Grant, he signed into law the 15th Amendment, which enfranchised black people as well in 1870. So, and remember, very, very importantly, that he did also create the Department of Justice to go after the KKK and to advance to promote and protect the civil rights of uh, African Americans. Now, again, I'd mentioned in an earlier video how he realized there was just this going to be this continued hostility from white Southerners, and they would, continue to be an obstacle to the realization of equality, equal citizenship rights, and progress of Black Americans within the caste system that existed in America. And so Ulysses Grant had planned, and he was very serious about it. He planned to annex what's today called the Dominican Republic. It was back then it was called Santo Domingo. They're on the same sort of island, or isthmus as Haiti, right? So, however, there was opposition from the Senate, especially from radical Republican Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, right? And he thought he was an expansionist, and he was opposed to the expansionist, intent. But importantly, President Grant had set up a commission to explore the idea, and I think Frederick Douglass was the one who headed the commission, but he was part of the commission. That's Frederick Douglass, the formerly enslaved, black man who became great, and that's Frederick Douglass. And so Frederick Douglass supported it. He gave a favorable report in about 1871, but again, Senate shut it down in 1870. They would not support it. So, and that idea of annexing Dominican Republic for the settlement of the newly freed Black Americans, so that they could thrive, they could rule themselves, they could, without the discrimination from, disaffected Southern whites, right? So that didn't succeed. But of course, again, in spite of the Reconstruction Acts, uh, uh, there was a reconstruction. There was a Civil Rights Act of 1875. That's sort of a precursor to what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964 under President Lyndon Johnson. There was a backlash by the Supreme Court in 1883. The Supreme Court said, well, that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional because the 14th Amendment dealt with that the 14th Amendment uh, dealt with discrimination by state action, right? Not by private individuals. And so it didn't that it was silent with regard to discrimination from private individuals and businesses. And the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was prohibiting discrimination against black people in inns, in hotels, by private businesses and private individuals. And so because of that, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1883 said, well, that Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional. And this was a catalyst to the Jim Crow era laws. And there was something called Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, which said, well, separate was equal. That they could create something parallel, that it was okay to segregate for whites to exclude black people from their facilities, so long as they had a parallel system, an alternative system that black people could use. And that was what created like a parallel economy in the South. And of course, this was very popular. And so it created the racist and degrading Jim Crow laws that subsequently followed. I'll stop this video here. My name is Osha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.